Thank you everyone here for coming to the webinar. This webinar is called Are We Asking Too Much of Learners Using Technology to Develop Executive Functioning Skills? It's part of our Learning Journey campaign focusing on executive functioning skills. And I am delighted to be here with Robin Poncia, who's our VP of Marketing and Professional Learning here at Hapara. Robin, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Josh. So thank you everyone for attending, first of all, taking time out of your schedules to do so. My name is Robin Poncia, and as Josh said, I am the VP of Marketing and Professional Learning here at Hapara. And I have a background in education as well as on the edtech side. So I was a teacher, I was a guidance counselor, I was a VP, I was a principal. I was then pulled into educational technology consulting and have been on the edtech side for quite a while now. I started teaching in 1985, which is, I'm sure, before some of you are even alive who are on this call. And the day I started teaching, we were using technology in the classroom, and this was in kindergarten, and this was in Florida, in the poorest district in all of Florida. So I feel like I've had a wide variety of experiences, and I feel quite passionately about the deepening learning through the use of technology. And I also feel very passionate about being student-driven, so on. So when I joined Hapara about 5 years ago, one of the things that was, Chromebooks were out there, they're being used, and one of the questions I immediately had as I started learning about Hapara, because I very much believe in their mission and our mission. And, here we have this monitoring tool, which at one time was called remote control, but became highlights. And so I started looking at this, and my instant thought, the guidance counselor in me is like, is that developmentally appropriate for learners? Are we expecting too much for them? And then as I got more and more involved with the development of product, my questions began to be a little bit more broad. Are we creating a platform that simply automates some tasks for the students? And does that take away an opportunity to learn? Or are our tools really helping learners be successful? And then, of course, what we all drive for, what else can we do to help with developing with these self-regulating skills and helping students learn how to become autonomous learners? So when I began that, one day I said to Nara, who's our head of product at Hapara, Nara from Hapara, I said to him, I'm going to go and I'm going to do a little bit of research and bring back to the team so we can really just keep a check on what we're developing, making sure it's right for kids and where they are in their learning spectrum. And so, my first question was, well, what brain function is responsible for self-regulation, and what does it look like in K-12 learners as it develops? And so what I learned is, of course, what we know are executive functioning skills. Well, these executive functioning skills rely on 3 types of brain function: working memory, cognitive flexibility, which they sometimes call shift, and that self-control. So what that might look like in the classroom, a working memory, it's like a first grader who doesn't have the ability to retain all the information that's being read to him or her, and they haven't developed a strong enough working memory. So their teacher may scaffold this experience by cutting down how long of a passage is read to that student before they have to recall details. Mental flexibility, what that may look like is, that great math teacher who says, okay, solve this problem, but I don't want you to just solve this problem. I want you to solve it in 3 different ways. And self-control. In that kindergarten classroom, it's a kindergarten classic. A student shouting out an answer without raising their hand. These as I was reading these definitions and doing my research, I saw several analogies around describing executive functioning in kids, EF skills. One of them I saw was development plus experience equals executive functioning. And another analogy I saw was growth plus pruning equals executive functioning. But as I, was doing my work, I ended up just settling on development plus self-awareness equals executive functioning. And you'll see why I think this way is a better describer as we go on here. So, look, Josh, who introduced me, created this cute little video right there. Our Heapy, the sheepy corn here at Hapara, if you haven't met yet. Heapy's showing us here that executive functioning works just like an air traffic control center. It's like a very highly effective air traffic controller. And it's a system where arrivals are processed, departures are processed, and dozens of planes on multiple runways, all these decisions going on all at the same time. And that's what is another way to kind of think of and view about executive functioning skills. So there's some need to know facts I want to cover here for the next few slides. First of all, children aren't born with these skills, but they are born with the potential to develop these skills. So next need to know fact. Executive function is grown through skill development. The more it is used, the more developed it becomes. And I had, just as an example, I wanted to share a story about two lovely young men that I taught who were sixth graders. And I was learning resource teacher in Canada at this time, and they came to me, for me to support their learning, and they were like, "Miss Poncia, you don't understand. We can't learn this." Like they were trying to convince me that they couldn't learn something. So I took them outside to the playground, and I showed them the dirt path, in the grassy area, the worn dirt path to the swing set. And I said, "Boys," I said, "do you see that? That's like processing in your brain. It is a path to understand the process to get to the answer that you have to get to." And guess what? Everybody has the ability to build a path to understand processes in order to get to the answer. And so right now, you just haven't developed that path. And the way we develop the path is by making a new path, a different path to the learning. So right now, your path is in that belief that you aren't able to learn it. And so we're going to create a new path, and we're going to wear down a new path. Well, I tell you what, those boys went out on that playground for that year and wore down a new path over to a different playground equipment. And to me, that just, as a teacher, I just love seeing that, because it's like they were showing the world, you know what, we can learn. And I think that's a really great story that they practice there. So when speaking of practice, brain circuits change and small successes build into big successes. So what happens though in some children, they have impairment of cognitive control, and this happens through addiction. So for example, gaming addiction in some children, ADHD, autism, and other central nervous system disorders. So what happens there, the stimulus dominate the behavior in the addiction. And so their impulse control there is not wired in the same way as other children. So speaking of ADHD, this was a YouTube video that I really wanted to draw your attention to. It is such a wonderful video. It's a young lady speaking about her journey in life with ADHD. And she explains ADHD in a really, I think, wonderful way. And it really is worth your time to watch educators, guidance counselors, school principals. So you have these words to talk to kids around. She uses the analogy of the wall of awful, and it's a ADHD response to simple tasks, why sometimes kids really struggle to get started with a task. And she describes this as, a teacher, passes out an assignment or gives an assignment, and a child with this ADHD response to simple tasks they immediately feel they're going to fail at the task even before they begin it. And that puts one brick in the wall. And then the next brick comes because they are sorry that they're disappointing their teacher. That's another brick. They're sorry that they're disappointing their parents. That's another brick. They're worried about what they look like in front of their peers. That's another brick. And what happens is these bricks stack up and stack up. There's no top. There's no way around it. And so, seeing this wall and then understanding that sometimes kids have struggles even getting started with a task because of their emotional response barriers. Just having these words to be able to just talk about and discuss with kids, I think would really be helpful. So please, you'll receive this slide deck after the webinar, along with the recording, and you can get in there and take a look at this. Jessica McCabe does such a great job with this, I think. So this is one thing. It is, yay, this is good news for us all. It can be improved at any time and at any point in a person's life. And let's talk about how that happens. Well, first, let's take a look at the development in children and how executive functioning skills, when they develop and how they develop. So if you're taking a look at this bar graph here, they have two periods of growth, and that's 0 to 3 is a huge part of that. Working memory is developing. They still don't have the ability for, self-control. And then there's another growth period, and that's in early adolescence. So both of those times are growth mode for young people. So now let's talk a bit about what executive function skills break down and look like. The way I like to describe these skills, or at least when I was growing up, it's the other side of the report card, the one without the grades, and it's the one where your heart stood still as you opened up your report card to look at it to see if your teacher had any ink on that side of the report card, because that's what your parents were going to look at just as much as the grade, or at least my parents did. So, so these are the executive functioning skills clustered together. There are researchers like George McCloskey who have those listed, broken down into 30 different functioning skills. But for our session, we're just clumping them broadly in these areas. So now we're going to look at what this manifests in life and looks like. We have these EF skills cluster in these 4 areas: self-management, time management, materials management, and information management. Now, self-management looks like taking responsibility for one's own behavior, actions, and well-being. An example where someone struggles with self-management may be that they wanted to challenge themselves and go into Algebra 1 instead of math applications class. And so they are in a class that they may struggle with the abstract concepts right off the bat, and they didn't raise their hand in class. They weren't able to complete their homework. Next day happens, the next lesson built upon the lesson before. The homework is not doable once again. We get to quiz by the end of the first week. The quiz is failed. The child may even skip class because they feel so far behind that they aren't able to get on top of the learning. So here, the child did not raise their hand and ask for help or meet a teacher afterwards and just say, I'm struggling. And just that act of asking for help I don't know if any of you subscribe to George Couros' Principles of Change and Innovating Inside the Box, I believe his work is called. But today, if you're on his email newsletter list, he sent out something. He said, I think asking for help early and frequently is better than not asking for help at all. And so it reminded me of this slide and this example. So another good person to follow there around this. So next is time management. This is the ability to use time effectively and productively. So an example for this may be a student signed up for too many advanced placement or IB classes. They had the intellectual ability to do the work, but they didn't have enough time to do all of the work. That's what they meant. That might look like in a classroom setting. Materials management. Marie Kondo. Materials management is the ability to manage the stuff of life. I have an example as a parent. I had a chalkboard posted beside our door that our boys left for every day to school, and I had a list, did you remember your lunch? Do you have your gym strip? Did you coordinate your after-school activities with your parents? And those kinds of things before they left, our routines that we just had to cover in a busy household. And I laugh because my boys called that visual nagging. So if you've had teenage boys, these kind of phrases may be familiar to you. And lastly, we have information management. The ability to acquire, retain, and use information. It's like the Google Drive of our lives. One of our Hapara champions, Julian Daher, he has some really great videos on our blog page. If you just Google Hapara blog, you'll be able to get to that easily. And Julian does a lovely piece where he talks about color coding Google Drive folders for kids at the beginning of the year, where he works with them. He gives them instruction on how to do that. That way, that color coding triggers things for them by project, by subject matter, etc. And he has a lovely little bit, so I encourage you to go and do that. He helped them easily organize that information so that they could easily get into tasks quickly and be able to get to work easily. So now I'd like to talk about that development curve of executive function. Here in this image, it's a very, kind of smooth looking experience, but it's really not. It actually occurs in spurts, and it's not fully developed until the age of 30. Now, I laugh at this because I'm sure all teachers, I taught primary, I also taught in other grades too, but in primary, this really resonated with me, where you taught something, you just knew they had that skill, and then the next week, it's like it was a foreign language to them. They didn't even know it. And so it's like, I just knew they had this, and it just disappeared. It's the same thing with executive functioning skills in children. They will have it, and then it seems like they don't have it. And we'll talk a bit about why that is in just a minute here. So just quickly, and I apologize, I know this is very dense information in this slide, but we wanted it to be able to stand on its own after this webinar, so that's why we put all this information in here. So I'll quickly go through this. Early childhood. Preschool children do not have the full maturity to continue to use their executive functioning, and of course they make errors as these emerging abilities happen. And it's not due because of the absence of the ability, but rather because the lack of awareness to know when and how to use particular strategies in particular contexts. So again, they lack the awareness, that ability to metacognitively get out of their body and to talk about their actions as like an outside observer. And that's where if you remember my analogy I used earlier, development plus awareness equals executive functioning. This is what was meaningful as I learned from this. Pre-adolescence. Executive functioning in pre-adolescence is limited because they do not reliably apply the executive functioning skills because they don't have the ability yet to fully self-control. They must be taught, they must be retaught, they must be coached, and they must be encouraged by supportive, consistent adults. In adolescence, the teaching, reteaching, coaching, and encouragement continues. And as adults, it's fully developed about age 29, 30, when we're most able to tackle the most complex tasks. We can keep building on these skills all through our lives, though. So, as an educator, or if you're here, if you are also a parent, you know this struggle. Whose job is it anyway to develop these skills? So many times I've been on both sides of this, where as a parent, I felt like it was the school's responsibility to help teach some of these skills. And then as being in the classroom and as guidance counselor's principal, I expected parents to also be teaching these skills. So whose job is it anyway? Well, I think we all look at each other, but I think it's both. If we learn that these are skills, just like spelling or multiplication or learning how to read music is a skill, then if we treat it that way, it takes a lot of the emotion out of our responses when children have EF skills difficulties. And we as educators and parents can start developing our own awareness about how to think about these skills, and then how to model, and then how to teach these skills in our classrooms, and how to use it in and leverage technology to help with these skills. And so we need to think about these as skills to develop, not behaviors to punish. And so take your time. So many times we then end up, especially in a very child-centered classroom, where we spend a lot of time compensating for the lack of skills. But what I'd like for you to think about is possibly changing your focus and putting more emphasis on teaching the skills and modeling the skills versus just spending all of your time compensating for the lack of the skills. So there are 3 ways to manage executive functioning challenges, and I'm just lightly going to go through this part because there are so many resources around this. But I do want to talk to you about this so that we can talk about it in terms of technology and how they can help with these executive functioning skills. So the way that EF skills are taught and worked through is to modify the environment, to teach the skill, and then to use incentives with students. So let's break that down and take a look at modifying the environment. We know these things: change the physical or social environment, adopt tasks, and then provide cues and supports. We do these already. We teach students the manners. We teach them how to how to work in a classroom and in group settings. We already adapt tasks, and we provide cues and supports. Really think about this in terms of more than just like behavior. Think about it in terms of developing these skills too. So next, teaching skills. One of the pieces of research that really hit home with me is really defining a missing skill and talking with a student as setting that as a goal that you're going to work on together, and then establish and proceed the procedures and work to achieve this goal, and then supervising the child during and after the procedure, and then evaluating and adjusting that, and having slowly pulling away from your involvement, where you're slowly removing that reward to have longer and longer periods of time is important. Here, layering preferred and non-preferred activities. What that means is if a child is really struggling during math, well, you might break down that they're doing math for shorter periods of times more frequently through the day, and that they can flip, like if you're using centers, for example, or independent inquiry project work, they can flip to a different task that they find more rewarding and an easier environment in which to function. And so then making sure that they have a place where they're practicing the task, meaning the non-preferred activity, layering with a preferred task so they can rest, relax, and kind of digest, their that practice and that skill development time there. Of course, specific positive feedback, and of course, having a choice of rewards. So the one thing that I think I've spent a lot of time talking about is teaching how to do these skills. And I'm going to encourage you to model your own journey. Think aloud while you're managing yourself and use that as a teaching opportunity. There's some wonderful videos from EDUCAUSE around this, of a teacher modeling how they're thinking out loud. And so I'd encourage you to do the same. So for example, I would say, I'm really anxious about remembering those items from home to bring to school tomorrow for our 100th day of school celebration. Now, how can I manage this? How can I make sure I remember these items? And then getting the kids to help you with that. I think I'll put a note on my door at home, or I'm setting an alarm on my phone to remind me just before I leave. And what are you going to do to remind yourself to bring these, items from home? And then having that kind of discussion. But purposefully, intentionally teach these tasks. I mean, have you really taught how to pay attention? I mean, I know when I was a kindergarten teacher, we did kind of talk about that at the beginning of the year. Oh, I see that Beth has her hands in her lap and she's not touching her neighbor. And I see how, thank you so much, Charles. I so appreciate you've got your eyes on me right now. And so I know when I taught in an older grade and a student would be presenting when we were doing project work, I would use the term, all right, Gary, could you please check your audience to see if they're ready? And so using words like that to trigger, and then they begin using those words. I'm checking my audience to see if you're ready yet for me to present. So things like that, just modeling those out, teaching those things. It's such a part of learning. It's not an add-on. It really does support the development of the subject matter that you're teaching. So don't feel like this is an add-on. It's embedded as a part of your everyday school life. So persistence. Once you find out what works, how do you help the student use it consistently? So, of course, just setting up a goal-oriented behavior, having that growth mindset in your classroom is just so important. Implement check-in systems. Hey, so I want you to be here at my desk on Thursday morning so we can just check out your, lay out your plan for the day. Could we do that? And let's get to just recess on this first part. Except successive approximation. You know what? They may not have been able to not talk during that whole lesson, but you know what? They made it all the way through to question point. That's pretty great, and to reward that. Start working towards the fading prompts, as we discussed. That's one thing that our tool Hapara Hapara Highlights does so well, I think, as a monitoring tool. Our philosophy behind it is for teachers to, when they first start using it, that of course they're going to want more control as they learn, like at the beginning of a new school year with students. they have more control, but hopefully as they build digital citizenship and awareness of digital identity with their students, and that it is a regular conversation in their classrooms, they will work towards those fading prompts with students where they, a teacher's not sitting behind their desk the whole lesson. They are still walking and working the room and working with students. Our idea with highlights is not for a teacher to be sitting at their desk killing screens. It's to be developing that digital citizenship over a period of time and having less and less control, handing the control over to the student for self-regulation. And of course, remembering that these are cycles of behavior. Just like I said, those kids may forget all about everything you taught them, but you'll get them back. You may have to, for example, with them, when I was talking about using highlights in classroom, you might have to bring it back in because they're off task regularly for a while, and you might have to have a little bit more control for a little bit, and then you again begin to space that out and hand over that self-regulation back to the students in small steps. So here are some really great strategies, classroom strategies. So I'm sending you this. This questionnaire and checklist it's really good because it really does help bring an awareness and to talk about EF skills outside of one's own self. And I really like that. So take a look at those resources there afterwards. So this step by step, it's basically building upon success. That's what happens. Each little step builds upon the next step. Remember that commercial, where I told two people about my shampoo, and then on the screen it doubles and then doubles, and the next thing you have all the hundreds of people that now use this shampoo. Well, it's the same thing with EF development. Little success builds upon success. So getting back to my original questions, are we creating tools that are developmentally appropriate for learners to use here at Hapara? And yes, I do believe we are. Learners do have the ability to learn how to self-regulate, and we as the important adults in their lives must learn how to foster the development of EF skills. And I've talked about highlights in our tool student dashboard here about how the gradual release control and student dashboard, which is our tool that really helps students organize learning, and it streams information from Google Classroom and Hapara from Workspace to the student, and it sets the priority based on due date. So streaming information from multiple teachers and platforms by due date. So it's way more organized for students to digest. So next question, are we creating a platform that simply automates the task for the student, taking away an opportunity to learn, or are our tools really helping learners to be successful? Well, students can lose track and are easily diverted online. We know that. They need an outside tool to assist them with these distractions in their journey, and gradually over time, self-regulation skills are developed. Focused browsing could be used just for test times, for example. So what we have to do here, what tools do Hapara help with developing self-regulating skills in learners? And one thing that as I was reading this information, it does reduce the mental load in students. So in place of having to remember all of these due dates and assignments, instead that working memory load is freed up. So now students can use that space to do the work rather than just remembering to do the work. And students are often swept into all those streams of notifications, which just, if you haven't seen what that looks like from a student perspective, one teacher may use Google Classroom, the next one doesn't and writes it on the chalkboard, the next one uses Hapara workspaces and streams learning to their students that way. Well, it could be overwhelming. When we were developing student dashboard, that's what we did. We interviewed kids from around the US, Canada, and New Zealand. And they just felt like it was just coming at them from all directions. And so to be able to calm that stream, all that stream, and stream that information, it just made it where kids had a sense of order and they felt more in charge and therefore more successful. So here's a quote from Dr. McCloskey, who's really well published in the EF area here. Assistive technology that lessens the cognitive burden of performing mechanical tasks, along with guided mentorship and formative feedback are needed. And this is where I think Hāpara fits in really nicely. They do a lot of these mechanical tasks. They organize, they send positive messages to students. They help you as an educator when you aren't feeling very patient, when somebody may be off task in an online environment, and sending messaging that is more positive and is definitely something that I think would have been like a cool drink of water and a little calm down moment if I were a teacher. So hopefully these kinds of tools that do help and guide give you the help you need in the classroom. So I'd like to, here we go. So next, what we did, the educators in our company, we all collaborated on this document, which was quite fun. We started listing executive functioning difficulties, and then we put down the Hāpara's functionality that we saw helped with these skills, and it became so much fun. We even went into the community. If you aren't aware of the Hāpara community, boy, do you need to get in there. Such a wonderful, rich experience, a place to go talk about teaching and learning with technology, not just Hāpara tools. It's a really, and you have the perspective of teachers from all over the world in there, which I think just makes it such a rich, kind of mind-stretching experience, kind of gets you out of your four walls of your classroom or the perspective of your school or school district. It gives you another take, and it's such a rich place. I encourage you to get in there. So what we did was we gleaned some comments out of the community and then our own experiences here, and the document just got so huge. So what we have for you for attending today is the infographic where we combined all that information into this. It was still so much. We had to cut a lot of it back, and we hope to continue the discussion in our community in the next couple of days. So we do thank you for attending, and I guess now's the time to hand back over to Josh, and so to see if we have any questions from anyone.
No, there are no chat questions right now. So I do want to say thank you so much, Robin, for the presentation. And for everyone else here, make sure to download that executive functioning skills infographic that Robin has linked in her slides. Also, we'll be sharing out the slides and the video via email, so stay tuned for that. And don't forget to check out our next webinar on student dashboard and how that ties into executive functioning skills. That link will be in the email as well. So thank you all for attending and have a great day.